Some of you may have noticed I'm not Stan Goldstein. Stan is sorry he couldn't be here today. He is under the weather. I'm Dick Altman. Stan asked me,
This is the only seat
the first thing he asked me to do was to ask you all to turn your cell phones off for the next hour, please. When Stan called me and asked me if I would introduce Les, I started thinking about previous journeys in life that I've heard since I've been here. And I was reminded of how diverse a community we have. We are a group of approximately 250 residents, made up of lawyers, doctors, engineers, accountants, career military people, veterans of 3 wars, nurses, teachers, dancers, musicians, salesmen, captains of industry, and a myriad of other professional specialties. But still, we all live under this one virtual umbrella. Yet, each of us has a unique personal experience of life. Now, I didn't mention the fact that we also have residents that come from 12 different countries. We have residents from Texas, from California.
Very good.
That were not included in the 12. They're from the Northwest, they're from the East, the Midwest, from the South. We even have residents from Florida.
Wow.
Now under this same umbrella, we live and we join together and we meet for lunch, we meet for dinner, we play cards together, play bunco, but we each have untold life stories. And so the Journey of Life program offers an opportunity for us to go know each other better. So if any of you are willing to share your life story, please contact Stan Goldstein. He would love to hear from you. Now, this afternoon, we're fortunate to have Les Kramer, a native Chicagoan who has been only a Village on the Green resident for approximately 8 months. Is that right, Les? But has a very interesting story to tell. You'd be interested in knowing his background, his interests, his skills, and his many achievements. He has even been able to bring us a taste of Chicago weather. So, here's Les Kramer.
Well, thank you, Dick. Boy, I'm really gratified. A lot of people showed up for a science lecture. As a matter of fact, I expected you to be heading towards the doors after I said that. But it actually is, in a way, a fun way. And that's the way my life has been, actually. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and put up a little bit of an introduction about me.
Les Kramer, congratulations on your selection for induction to the Florida Inventors Hall of Fame. This is a recognition that has been well earned, and your technical contributions have had lasting impact on many fields, including aerospace and defense, medical devices, power generation, and many, many more. Your patents and publications clearly attest to the depth of your achievements and, of course, your dazzling intellect.
Google defines invention as creation of a product or introduction of a process for the first time. Creation is the key that identifies the need for the invention, the problem to be solved, and the market served. Creation benefits from nonlinear thinkers that have laboratory skills. In other words, people that know how to work with both their head and their hands. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a post-war family of 4. My father, Myron, was an engineering student during the war and then returned to the family paint store. He was a creator, a craftsman, a problem solver, and a fabricator of the most beautiful model trains you'd ever want to see. He taught me how to use hand tools and how to be a craftsman. And as a result, I won a model building contest at the age of 8. In 5th grade, I discovered electromagnetic waves. First, I built a crystal radio. Then I built a regenerative receiver. And along the way, my dad taught me how to find electronic parts, how to solder, and how to do sheet metal fabrication. With these skills, I've been an amateur radio operator since 1959. Then I discovered the wonders of AC induction and built a giant repulsion coil. This device could throw an aluminum ring 6 feet in the air and allowed me to compete in the Chicago Science Fair. My father taught me where to find number 12 double cotton covered wire and transformer laminations. Unfortunately, my poor mom had her table pad destroyed by our coil winding efforts. As a young inventor, I've had many mishaps along the way. For instance, everybody knows how cold it is in Chicago, yet I hydroponically grew sugar cane and sweet potatoes and other crops year-round on our back porch. One evening while I was showing off my plants to a friend, I slipped and fell and punched out a window and severely lacerated my arm. So instead of a night at the movies for my parents, they spent a night at the hospital. I was always interested in robotics as a teenager. One day, a friend of mine and I made a prototype robot. Just as we turned it on, his mom came down the steps to the basement with some cookies for us. The robot whizzed by her, the cookies went in the air, the robot slammed against the back wall of the basement, and my robotics career was abruptly ended. Yeah, the following year, I developed an interest in time-lapse photography. I took a Lionel train transformer, a war souvenir electric movie camera, and built a timer to take time-lapse pictures of morning glories opening and closing during the day. Along the way, I almost fell off the roof of the garage, but the movies were really spectacular. In my mind, 2 patents stand out. The ABES process, ABES stands for Adhesively Bonded Erosion Shield Technology, was an important lesson learned because I had to fail before I succeeded commercially. Just because I didn't succeed in my first application doesn't mean the ABES process was a failure. My initial field trials indicated that it was not suitable for steam turbine erosion shield application. With just a simple change in materials from a metal to a ceramic, I found that the ABES process was the right solution at the right time for the repair of phosphate mining pumps. The result of this was that I had a viable business headquartered out of my garage in Longwood, Florida for 3 years. The tailor-made prosthetic foot had the greatest societal impact of any of my patents. Over 2,000 lower limb amputees are currently using this device, including 2 Boston Marathon bombing victims. One of the features of the tailor-made prosthetic foot is it releases energy to the toe and heel at the proper time in the gait cycle. It adapts to sports activities such as golf or skateboarding, and it also provides improved stability walking up stairs and ramps. Looking back on my career, my inventions have improved human life and safety, have helped lower limb amputees walk normally, have solved industrial problems to increase profitability, have aided academic institutions to gain licensing income, and of course I want to thank my wife Lynn for her continuing support and encouragement over these many years. I couldn't have been successful without her. The real question is, how did I get to a position where I could do that? And so there's a story in back of that story. So I thought I would tell that. There we go. I view my life in 7 phases. Okay, my early years and my learning of skills, mainly from my father. My teen years and some experimentation I did. Then there's
Nirvana Amongst the Corn, we'll talk about that in some detail, and Passions at Penn State, and that's not a dime store novel. And then some career changes and things I've done, even though I didn't change between too many businesses, just two. And then my pseudo-retirement after retirement. And then finally continuing the saga while I'm at Village on the Green. So let's start off with this. I wanted to put up a little bit of an anagram and see if in a fraction of a minute, you folks can come up with that, with the answer. Yeah. Okay. So I don't hear any people that have got the answer, so I'll go through it. Let's see if this is supposed to work. But it doesn't go too well on the screen. Anyway, if. Who's the F?
Enrico Fermi.
That's exactly correct.
I've been coached.
Oh, screwed up. CP1, which stands for Chicago Pile 1, which happened to be under the bleachers of Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, there would have been a nuclear explosion. And then, the T in the hen, I know that's bad. Chicago Lion Inn and Hospital, where I was born, and myself would be gone. But that didn't happen. Okay, my early years. Well, my father was a train modeler, as I showed, and so I got into that at a very young age, and I must have made dozens and dozens and dozens and probably hundreds of flying model airplanes. That was my passion. In the beginning, it was ones that were driven by a rubber band you just wind up, and then as I got a little older, I put a gasoline engine on it, and that's the picture of a similar engine to what I had. But those engines take a little time to break in before they start reliably. So I decided to break mine in my bedroom, and the result was the carbon monoxide made me very sick. My mother ran in, opened the windows, and told me I couldn't do that again. And I wasn't going to anyway. But I was also fascinated by the designs of real aircraft. And the one at the top left here is a P-80 Shooting Star made by Lockheed. And it didn't see service in World War II, but it was flying at the end of World War II. And then what happened is they found during the Korean War it wasn't so good against the Russian jets. So they made it into a trainer, and that's the picture in the bottom is a T-33. And that was a very successful trainer that flew for 40 years or something like that with air forces around the world. Then they tried to make an all-weather interceptor out of it, and that's the F-94 in the upper right there. And that was a bit of a bomb because it just didn't have the performance. So I was real interested, though, the way they tried to repurpose this one airplane. And I looked for a lot of that when I was looking at airplane designs. And then there was some really weird stuff the U.S. came up with in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, particularly 50s and 60s. There was the pogo stick, which is the one sitting on its tail, and that flew very nicely. But when the pilot wanted to come back to land, he didn't know where the ground was because he couldn't see it. So they found that was a defect. Then the little Goblin, that was intended to protect the big B-36, and they found out that it was kind of an unstable airplane. You can kind of get a feeling by just looking at it. And it was really hard to hook up when it came back to B-36 after a mission. So they scrubbed that one. Everything's learning. Okay, but anyway, I then got interested in electricity and radio. Part of it was the book on the upper left Boy Electrician. It was published in 1929, and boy did it have good stuff in it. And one of the things it had in it was things to do with a Model T Ford spark coil, and some of you may actually recognize that as a Model T Ford spark coil, with the interrupter on the top. I can't tell you how many times I got shocked off that thing. But one of the things I did do is I made a Jacob's ladder, and you remember in the old science fiction movies, they would have this spark go up horizontally, and I was doing that with my Model T Ford spark coil. And then there was another experiment that said, if you placed tissue paper between the hands and the ears of adjacent people and connected it up to the spark coil and to a carbon telephone, if you spoke into the telephone, everybody in line could hear that. And so my science teacher at school thought that was neat. So he lined the whole class up, put tissue paper between the hands of each student and the adjacent student's ears, hooked it up, and I spoke into it, and nothing happened. So he said, it must be the tissue paper. All the students took out the tissue paper, and then I spoke into it, and they all jumped. Okay, I don't know why this thing keeps going dark on me, but anyway. And then on the right is the giant repulsion coil, and I was doing magnetic levitation back in the 50s. And anyway, from there, I got interested in radio. So, you know, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you could make an AM radio with a Quaker Oats box and some wire, simple rectifier, and a few capacitors. And so I did that, and sure enough, I was able to go and tune in the powerful stations that were in Chicago, like WLS and those. From there, my dad sat me down and said, well, now let's see what you can do with sheet metal and mounting things to sheet metal. So we built a regenerative receiver. And from there, I graduated up to night kits, and what you could do, you could buy a piece of plywood that had these clips on them and a bunch of tubes and radio parts and electronic parts. You could just clip it all together, and you could make a radio, you could make an electric eye that would turn on, a light if somebody passed by it. I mean, there's all sorts of electronic devices in the days of tubes that you could put together and have a good time with. So I did. Okay, and that led me to trying to make my first radio, and that's the one in the lower right, and that was an adjunct failure. I tried to do it with my shop teacher in high school, and unfortunately, he was very anxious to get students into the shop and working with the equipment and learn electronics himself, but he wasn't any good to me. I knew more than he did. So anyway, moving right along, I was also very much affected by the movies of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And if you don't know, the movie on the robot on the left, that's I, Tobar from Captain Video. Anybody see that? Hey, I got a few hands. And then, of course, there's the wonderful science fiction movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still, with the giant robot Gord. I loved Gord. And then there's Robbie from Forbidden Planet. Not to mention, I always saw the episodes of Sky King and John Wayne. We watched on our little 7-inch TV. And of course, on Sunday mornings, for whatever reason, they'd show Flash Gordon with his ray guns and his rocket ship. And now, basically, all that's come true. Okay, my teen years. Well, I talked about the hydroponics. And hydroponics, for those of you that don't know, that's when you're growing plants where you put your fertilizer in water and they're not grown in dirt. And so I used to have strings going up to the ceiling on our back porch with sweet potatoes winding around it, or even sugar cane. And then I got into the time-lapse photography. Now with the radio, we used to go every summer to see my aunt and uncle and grandparents in St. Louis. And, you know, in those days, when you talked mobile, you weren't talking about this.
Yeah.
If I can get back in now. So, anyway, I went out and bought from Heathkit that little tan radio there, and that same antenna I had mounted on the bumper of our car, and off we'd go every summer with that arrangement. And I would be calling to talk to people, and when we got close to St. Louis, I would talk to people and give them my aunt's phone number so they could call ahead and say, hey, they're coming. It was great fun. My father was a little cramped on the driving, though. So anyway, my senior year in high school, I got enamored with rockets. I mean, hey, it was the start of the space race, right? And I was a red-blooded American kid that wanted to beat the Russians. So I started making rockets in CO2 cartridges. And we had the same basic setup as that. We had that's got a load cell which measures the force the rocket's pressing down. We had to do it on the cheap. We used a bathroom scale. And then for a holder, we used a black iron pipe. And that worked really well. I mean, we were getting 30, 40 pounds of thrust out of a single CO2 cartridge until we made fuel that was just a little too hot. And you can imagine what happened. And my friend Bruce didn't appreciate it because he got a piece of shrapnel in his foot. And that was the end of my rocketry. But we both had fun while we were doing it. Another thing I did with chemistry was nitrogen triiodide. This is a wonderful, unstable compound. And when you make it, it's just a little paste. And you can put just a little bit on the table. Boy, it would work really well here. Okay, it waked people up. And when that little thing dried out, it would go and give a snap, and there'd be a beautiful little purple mushroom cloud. So, as a result of that, I played around with that a little bit, but I didn't get to the extent the guy in the picture did, where he made a big mushroom cloud. I was just doing it to jazz my friends off. And then I did a lot of high-speed photography. My dad was really interested in photography, and he built a full dark room in the basement of our apartment. We had an enlarger there we had running water, and it was really one of these storage units they have in the basements of apartments, and he did a beautiful job setting that up. And there was one closet up in the apartment where we could load the film into what was called the tank, so we could then go and develop the film and then dry it up in the apartment. Then we could run down to the basement and print it on the enlarger and, you know, do all sorts of things with it. But I was into high-speed photography. Moving right along. Well, I did a lot of stuff in my teen years, but being good in school wasn't one of them. I entered the Westinghouse Science Talent Search with my time-lapse photography, but I flunked trig. I've one marking period, the same with chemistry. I did lousy on the SATs. And so I wanted to go to Illinois Institute of Technology because that's where my dad went during the war, but they said no. In Illinois, I said yes because I was an Illinois resident. I had better than a C average, and so they had to accept me. So I was a little down, but I read the books they assigned me, and I wrote the book reports, and I submitted them, and lo and behold, they let me in. And so everything changed. I became an Illini, and I had so many new experiences. For instance, I had braces when I was a kid. It cost my folks $3,000 over 5 years, and they wouldn't let me go near to contact sport. I went to the University of Illinois the first day. I played a week, starting the first day, I played a week of intramural football where I was the center. And I had black and blue marks all the way from my wrist to my arm, and I loved every moment of it. So then I decided, well, what else can I do? So I joined the theater, and they gave me a paintbrush and some gym shoes, and they said, paint. So I painted. I painted props. I helped put them together. I thought that was neat, but then I wanted to try something else. And it turns out the dorms in Illinois have a radio station called WPGU, and the radio waves come into the receivers through the plug. They're not through the air. So I became a radio engineer and a disc jockey for a couple thousand kids that were in the dorms. And that lasted a while. And then I had to join an ROTC, and I joined the Air Force, because in those days, every student at a land-grant college had to serve 2 years in one of the ROTCs, and then if they wanted to go on, they could get an officer's commission. And I elected not to go on, but I did do a lot of singing, and interestingly enough, that was when I started, and I'm still doing it. Some of you will notice on Monday nights, some Mondays I'm not here. I'm over at Seminole State College singing with a community chorus. Okay, I listened to a lot of folk music, and Peter, Paul, and Mary actually came to campus. And then the professors had poker night with the students, at least in the, when I got to the higher levels, you know, third and fourth year. And you know, students always kind of put their professors to some degree up on a pedestal because of what they'd accomplished and what they knew. And boy, what did the paradigm change. We went into this one guy's basement and we played cutthroat poker. And I learned that the professors could be cutthroat. And then when I'd go home, the Illinois Central ran through Champaign-Urbana and went to Chicago. And so they had what we call Jesse James cars. For like Thanksgiving holiday, we'd go home. It was $5 for a single way to go to Chicago, which in those days is not too bad. It was pretty cheap. The only proviso was, it was putting as many students as you can be on the train, and you didn't necessarily get a seat. So a lot of the times I sat for 2 hours on my suitcase, but we had a great time in the car, and you know, it was typical student fare. And then the other thing that unfortunately Stan, since he's sick, would appreciate, and he's not here, but as part of Air Force ROTC, they took the students out on what they used to call certification flights, because the pilots that were ROTC instructors had to keep recertifying in an airplane every so often. So I remember to this day, it was a DC-3, which the military calls a C-47. It had seats going along both sides and a depression, and they were just stamped steel seats. And what you did with that depression was you put your butt parachute on it, and you sat on your parachute. And then if the airplane got in trouble in the air, before you hooked up your parachute on the line to jump out the door, you had to remove the door. And the way you did that is you would go up to the hinge pins and just kick them out, and the door would fly off, and out everybody would go. Fortunately, my 1 or 2 flights didn't need that. Okay. Now, there's one real interesting thing that happened to me. My dad, when he went to IIT during the war, he got a book. And this is it. It has a signature and everything, and it's called The Principles of Metallography by Williams and Homerberg. And metallography is a technique that's used in material science to look at the structure of metals. And I'm going to put the mic down and I'm going to show you some pictures just real quick. Okay. There's all sorts of round pictures. It turns out those are structures of metal after they've been heat treated and stuff like that. And there's also what's called a phase diagram here. I used to read this pretty much constantly, wondering what was in that book. So I got to the University of Illinois, and they do a wonderful job, and still do, what they call engineering open house. They have every department with the professors out there. You can ask them any question. So I talked to them about that book and the pictures in it. And that's how I really got hooked on metallurgical engineering. So that's where I actually signed up for that profession, and still doing it. And I got a job, and it was part of what they called the work scholarship. You had to maintain a B average, and you had to work 20 hours at least for some project or professor or group in the materials engineering department. And as a result, they would waive your tuition and fees. And they would also go and give you a small hourly stipend for your work. And between those two things, I pretty much got through college, and of course took jobs during the summer, and that got me further money-wise, so I was able to support myself. And one of the things I did was I electropolished really pure gold for the electron microscope, which is what that right-hand picture is. And the really pure gold, the scrap from that we would just put in a jar up on a shelf in a lab. And it amazed me. Nobody would touch it. And I mean, they had probably maybe between 1.25 pounds of scrap gold, highly pure gold, more than 28 karat or whatever. I mean, and the reason it had to be so pure is they were looking for atomic differences in the electron microscope. Okay. Illinois is where I first got my first recognitions. I belonged to a service fraternity called National Society of Professional Engineers, and they had an engineers ball every year, and they had a group they introduced every year of their awardees. They called them Knights of St. Pat, and I have a sword from the Knights of St. Pat that they gave me. It's about that long. And also I was able to join an honorary from the department. I also had 2 internships that also helped me stay in college. One was from Inland Steel, and it was during the summer, and I was running around in a full fireproof suit, probably with asbestos in it, a hard hat, steel-toed safety shoes, and we had to be there when they opened up the port in the blast furnace to let the pig iron out. And so when that happened, you had all these little BBs of red-hot pig iron go skittering across the floor. And that you had to be fast on your feet. I was. And the other thing, next year I actually got a job in Pittsburgh at the United States Steel Applied Research Lab, and I worked on improving tin plate for food cans. And then in '66, in January, I got my bachelor's degree and moved right along to passionate Penn State. And the first thing I had to do was pick a thesis advisor, and I picked a really nice man who was very, very good with his students and spent a lot of time with them. And I was with him for a total of 5 years. And he taught me scientific glass blowing, and you can see an example of that on the right. And the thing about scientific glass blowing is you always start with usually tubes or specific shapes, and you attach them rather than just a glob of glass that you do in artistic glass blowing. So I could fuse together all sorts of tubes of different diameters and stuff like that. And I used that in my research. And then in '68, I got my master's degree. And then I continued on with my doctorate. And in 1971, the Vietnam War was winding down. Engineers were being laid off from the aerospace companies. Jobs were hard to find. And so one day I walked into my advisor's office, and he very gently told me he was running out of money for me. I said, well, I don't have a job. And he said, well, try harder. So anyway, I did get one interview, and that was with Westinghouse Electric Corporation. And they sent me an acceptance letter, which I, of course, accepted. And walked in the next day to my professor, and I said, guess what? I've got to be at Westinghouse in 90 days. So I'm starting my thesis today. And he looked at me and says, nobody's ever done that. I said, well, I'm going to do it. And sure enough, I did it in 85 days. The last part of it, Lynn was in the lab with me, and we were actually putting microscopic pictures into the thesis. We needed 3 copies. We got it done, hauled it off to the graduate school. They didn't find anything wrong with it, and off we were to Pennsylvania. But getting back to other passions, Lynn and I met at a blind date at Penn State. And it turns out we both had the same dorm room at Penn State. She moved in first when it was a girls' dorm. And then she moved out to another dorm, and I moved in, and it was a graduate dorm. So it turned out that for me to take her out for dinner, let's say, or a movie, I would have to get her back by 10:30, 11 o'clock at her dorm. But there were no rules because I was supposed to be mature. I was older. I was a graduate student. There were no rules for me in having women in my dorm. So she came over, and the first thing she said is, see that rack over there on the wall? And I said, yeah, I haven't used it. She said, well, I did. That's where I hung my stockings. So anyway, darn it, the light went down again, but there is a window circled in that lower picture, which is where 255 Atherton Hall is located. Oh, and 90 days after we met, we were engaged, and 90 days after that, we were married in D.C., and then we started work in earnest. Lynn was a teacher in a steel town about 30 miles over the mountains from where I was going to school at Penn State. And I was, of course, kicking my research into top gear because it was time for me, now that I had a wife, I was going to have to support at some point in time. So why not push it as hard as I could, and I did. Okay, now I'm going to talk about my career zigzags, which are interesting. In July of 71, I went and I joined Westinghouse. And the first thing they asked me to do was to become a turbine blade forensic specialist. And so every turbine blade that broke, they bring to me, and I look at it at the lab, and I make a pronouncement as to the alloy was wrong, or the design is wrong, or the guy, the user misused it, or whatever. And so I did that for a number of years. And as you can imagine, if they had a lot of turbine blades breaking, then there'd be a lot of trips for Les Kramer to go out and see him. And I did that. And then after a while, there were some technical concerns about turbine blades and certain alloys that I was expert in. And so they went and they started sending me to conferences and to different meetings just to learn, as well as to educate people as far as our design and how we use the alloys. And then after I did that for a while, in 1974, on Lake Gallatin outside of Nashville, there is a power plant called TVA Gallatin Plant, and unit number 2 in TVA Gallatin Plant blew up. And it spread bolts and casting fragments a quarter-mile from the plant. And so they were looking around for somebody to become the chief investigator, and they tapped me for it. So I went down there and spent a lot of time down in Tennessee. And you can't see it in that picture, but there's a big crack. I'm going to be very careful walking over this wire. You can see that big dark area, and that's all crack. So this thing was running at 3,600 RPM, which is 60 hertz, which is what our electricity is, when it blew, and the crack was that big in there. So that was really something, and if you could get closer here, you can see the size of the fragments that came off the rotor. The rotor is a central spinning device that's in the turbine. Okay, and then in 1999, they had a job down in Colombia, and they asked me to go, so I did. And I won't go into the details, but needless to say, it was a third world country, and I had some significant adventures. And also, I had great fun trying to get out of the airport. Fun, it really wasn't, but anyway. The bottom line on that was I went upstairs to the airline, and I didn't know where the plane was going, but I was glad to get out of Colombia. Okay, now the power industry requires really, really, really big pieces of steel, and it has to be fairly pure. And we're talking about steel that's as far as the first row here to the end of the room in length, and about as big in diameter as from the floor to the ceiling. I mean, this takes really large forges, and there are relatively few of them. And from 71 to 81, US manufacturers decided they didn't want to have that business. So 4 of them went bankrupt, and 1 of them just stopped making that grade of steel, and it put us in a real tight bind. Fortunately, the only people that were making it at the time were the Japanese. And so there were 3 vendors that we decided to negotiate with and required 2 trips of 3 weeks each in Japan. And along the way, I also gave a technical paper to the Japan Iron and Steel Institute. So that was a lot of fun. And I had many, many, many interesting stories, some of which the Levines have heard many times, about my times in Japan. But it was very interesting, physically, intellectually, and business-wise. And I also learned the value of trying to learn the language. So in 1983, I got moved down here by Westinghouse And within 2 years, the motto on the coffee cup they gave me, which said Westinghouse, a new day dawning, showed that the new day was not necessarily dawning properly. And so I decided it was time to leave. And so I went to Martin Marietta. And so the first job they gave me was actually a research job, and it was on this missile called SLAT, Supersonic Low Altitude Target. And the thing that made it really tough was it had 2 engines in it. It had a rocket engine, and then that converted to what's called a ramjet. I won't go into the differences unless you're interested, but to make that transition was a very hard thing technologically to do. And so there were certain heat-resistant plastics, and I got involved with that, and we finally got it to work. And then a little later on, I had a research project on molding of plastics. And we found that the Javelin missile was overweight, and the Army wouldn't accept it if it was more than 25 pounds. This is the missile itself. So I told them that we needed to put the wings and fins, make them out of plastic rather than out of metal, and of course everybody said, we've never done that. So I did it, and we got them through the wind tunnel, and the wings and fins have never failed in service, as the Russians will definitely attest to. And then, one day Lynn and I have the kids in the car, we're gonna see her folks down in Naples. The phone rings, the kids are yelling in the car, and it's only the vice president of Martin that asked me to take on this project. It turns out that there's a targeting pod called Lantern, which is on F-16s and F-15s, and this back end, that little square thing, I'm almost afraid to do this again, but anyway, that lower picture, you can see the back end is kind of square. That whole assembly was just tipping off it and almost failed. And the thing about that is if you had airplanes flying close together, all you needed is one to fail and you could maybe take down 2 airplanes. So that was not a good thing. So I went and got involved with that, although we did take the weekend off. And the result of that was that I found that the vendor of a clamp that was holding that back end on had falsified quality records, and which is a definite federal offense. And he actually ended up in jail. So I thought that was interesting. And in 1999, Lockheed wanted to go and increase the number of senior technical people they had, and so they opened up a director's slot in engineering, and I was lucky enough to go and be selected one of the people. And one of the nice things is that if I came up with an idea that was in the interest of the company, and if I could get it funded, they didn't care. They just let me do my thing. And of course I had to go through the usual reviews and stuff, but it was really a dream job. And so one day I'm in the Joint Strike Fighter assembly plant in Fort Worth, Texas, and one of the engineers there comes up to me and he says, hey, do you know what nanotubes are? And I said, no, I've never heard of them. He said, well, why don't you go talk to Rick Smalley, who's down at Rice University in Houston? And I thought that was a neat idea, so I said, yeah, okay, I'm willing to learn. And so he calls this guy up, and the guy clears his next day for me. Little did I know that he was one of 3 Nobel laureates. And so as a result of that, I went down there and I learned about buckyballs, which is what he and three other guys shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in '96 for. And he was working on nanotubes. Now, buckyball is like a soccer ball. It's got 60 atoms in it. And if you were to slice it, okay, if you were to slice it in half and take a tube of graphite and graft half a ball on each end, that's a nanotube. And these things are 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. I mean, they're real small. And I thought that they would be good for substituting for carbon fiber that's used in airplanes, tennis rackets, golf clubs. So I went down there and actually we decided to go and try to make some of this stuff and try to make some prototype structures. Whereas Smalley was only interested in doing the science on it, we wanted to do the engineering. So we did. And we fabricated these things called Bucky paper, which were just a bunch of nanotubes in a flat mat. And we could align them or we could have them in a random orientation. And we did all sorts of things to the structures that we made out of them. One of which is we put it through lightning strike, which is like 500,000 volts and hundreds of amps per square centimeter. And we found that when all the tubes were aligned in one direction, that the lightning could not hurt it. And what that said to us that these things could be used for modern airplanes to help with their lightning strike design. All modern airplanes today have some lightning strike protection. That's why when they're hit by lightning, they don't go down. And I'm sure some of you have been on airplanes in a thunderstorm and maybe even been struck, and the airplane just keeps moving along. Okay. And then the last project I was involved with Martin was OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, and what this is a way of capturing electrical energy from the sea, from the temperature differences in the sea. So here we go. Hello. Okay.
Energy exists all around us. Despite this, no one solution has been developed to meet global demand for secure, responsible, and economic power. But by advancing technology, we are coming closer every day. The ocean offers the single largest opportunity for meeting our energy needs. It acts as the world's largest solar panel, collecting 80% of the energy the Earth receives from the sun, or enough to offset 250 billion barrels of oil every day. And while this surface water is heating up, the ocean's depths remain cold. Known as OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, turns this difference into power. The process starts when warm surface water is used to boil a fluid, producing steam. The steam turns a turbine, generating electricity. Cold water from the ocean's depths condenses the steam back into liquid, completing the cycle. Several challenges have stood in the way of making OTEC a reality. It's a large system permanently located offshore. It needs to be robust, and the cool water is located very deep. To address these challenges, Lockheed Martin has developed a unique OTEC system design. The OTEC platform is first brought out to sea. The pipe is then made section by section. Next, the power system is installed. Cables are run from the platform to carry power back to shore. Like many renewable energy sources, OTEC offers a responsible way to meet growing power needs. The advantage of OTEC is that it provides continuous, consistent base load power. The energy created by the plant can also be used to generate hydrogen and clean water. Estimates even show that building each plant will create about 3,500 jobs. Finally, OTEC provides a domestic energy source, increasing energy security. At Lockheed Martin, our commitment is to advancing global security. With energy security concerns on the rise, we are working to make solutions like OTEC a reality. With decades of experience building, operating, and servicing critical equipment above and below the water, we've become experts at thriving in its environment. Our commitment is to a better future. By finding solutions for one of the biggest challenges of our time, we are working to make this goal a reality.
Okay, I was the chief scientist of the project, and the really neat thing about this project was the number of times Lynn and I went out to Hawaii. But they did make in Hawaii, on the island of Big Island of Hawaii, they actually have a working OTEC plant.
Mike.
Yeah, they actually have a working OTEC plant out there. So anyway, moving right along. So I'm not going to get into this stuff other than to say that I've done a lot of entrepreneurial things while I was working for Lockheed over the 25 years. I was an expert witness in the UK on a turbine problem. I actually won a SB, Small Business Innovative Research Grant with a friend to make a remote reporting snow scales. We called it SnowSense. And my first meeting with the customer, I told him that for two guys from Florida, this project makes no sense. We got 2 units. And then the A-Best turbine blade repair, you've already seen that in a prior video, and then how I did the pump repair, so we don't need to talk about that. Okay, now what I've been doing since I retired, well, the first thing is I only stayed retired for 90 days. Then I formed an LLC, and you can see in the upper corner, that's the logo of it. And then what we did, we got into a project for Bucky paper commercialization, and the people I hired came up with a wonderful design, but not such a good machinery, so that did not work. Then we won a subcontract from FSU for the Veterans Administration on prosthetics, and this was my first delving into prosthetics. And what it was, it dealt with the socket. The socket is the hard mechanical piece that goes around the leg, and most amputees first have their leg, then they have a big silicone rubber, for want of a better word, condom that goes on there to prevent lesions and things like that. Then they have this hard composite thing that is actually structurally taking the forces and putting it into the rest of the prosthetic. And if it gets too loose or too hard over that silicone rubber thing, they'll put a sock. And so what we were trying to do was we were trying to go and get rid of the socks and make the silicone rubber have cooling in there so they would feel comfortable and they would not get lesions. And so that lasted for about 2.5 years. And we did solve many of those problems. We didn't get them all, but it was, hopefully some of that was picked up and used in the VA because it was good science. And then the other thing that's kept me busy is the development of the tailor-made foot, the prosthetic foot. And that directly resulted from contacts I made on the SOCAD program. And the thing about this foot is that it allows the toe and the heel to independently operate. And we did a lot of engineering testing on that and that kind of thing. And then we opened a business in, I think it was about 2017, we went into production. And there's at least 3 that I know of Boston bombing victims that are wearing at least one of our feet. And let me show you the foot. This is what the foot looks like. The thing that's also unique about that is the toe and the heel pieces can be removed, and stiffer or softer ones can be put in their place. Also, if somebody wants a longer toe or a shorter toe, just by pulling this device in the front of the foot, the pieces will come out, and in 30 seconds, they can be repositioned with a new shorter or longer or more stiff or less stiff piece. That's why we call it tailor-made. It's tailor-made to the person. Also, there's an energy recovery system that's in this part of the foot. And there are 2 springs in there. And we have the springs color-coded. So a blue spring would be somebody that's maybe 100 to 110 pounds. And a green spring is probably somebody that goes up to 220 or 250. And so we can change the springs for the weight of the person and their activity level. So it turned out to be really a fairly useful device that I happened to come up with. Okay, and here you can see, well, maybe you can't see, this lady in this one picture is one of the Boston marathon bombing victims. And then in the third picture, there's a fellow that's up in the rocks. There's several world-class rock climbers that have prostheses. And so there's really no limit to if somebody wants to get into some kind of weird athletic thing, you probably can with this foot, with maybe the exception of running or something like that, where they use the long Oscar Pistorius type foot. That still has more spring than our foot does. Whoops. Sorry about that. Okay, and the other thing is I was lucky enough to be inducted into the Florida Inventors Hall of Fame. I have a total of 19 patents. 17 of them are domestic, 2 of them are foreign. One's in Japan. One of the foreign ones is in Japan, the other's in the EU. So, and I have a total of 7 that are associated with this foot alone. So that was the induction ceremony. And just one more slide. You may be wondering what I'm doing in my garage when you go by Green Trail. And I guarantee you it's not what you're doing. You may hear some hopefully not too loud clanking, which is my vacuum pump. Or you may hear electric drills and stuff like that. But since I've gotten here, it's been painfully obvious to me that something's got to be done about falling. And so I currently am working on methods. I haven't come to a solution yet, but I am looking at different ways of using different types of materials that could potentially prevent fall or mitigate the effects of falls. You may fall, but you will have something between you and the ground that will prevent you from getting really badly hurt. There is one device that I've seen out on the internet right now, just so everybody can see it, you can understand. There is a device that I think is probably working pretty good, and it uses selectable airbags, and it uses a high pressure gas system. So no matter where you fall, automatically the head is protected, it inflates. And then if you're turning or something like that, you'll get certain airbags down here and up here that will open up. It's a pretty elegant solution to falling. It's a vest, and it's also about $1,000. And if you use it once, it costs about $130 just to put more gas into it and to restuff the airbags in there so they'll work. But it is a solution. And it's not the one that I want to do because I think it's way too expensive and has other technical faults that I think can be overcome. But I do think it's probably working today. And the good news I'm bringing it up is because it's just one of probably many solutions that are going to come along in the next couple of years, hopefully. The other thing is, I would bet that at least half the people in this room have walkers. And I would be willing to bet also that half those walkers, at least, probably 3/4 of them, are made out of steel. And I'd also be willing to bet that you have trouble getting the steel walkers in your trunk of your car. And as a result of that, I'm looking again at using composite materials to cut the weight of the walkers down and also add functionality. I haven't decided where I'm going with that yet, but I think that most of the walkers probably could use a stability improvement. And also, how many of the walkers, I see people bent over when they're walking. And there needs to be some kind, I think, of orthopedic support that's worked into it. And there are a lot of other things I've been thinking about doing with walkers too, like putting a detachable weather canopy on them, adding some electronics. You know, you might want earbuds on your walk, you know. So that's where my mind is on this, and whether any of this stuff is going to jump out and become practical, I don't know. But that's what I'm hopefully going to be doing over the next year. All I got to do is come together with a decent design I like. Okay. Well, thank you. You stuck with me for over an hour, so I'm very impressed.
Thank you, Les, for making us all feel very inadequate. And again, I implore any of you that would like to share your life story to get in touch with Stan Goldstein. Thanks again, Les.